Hello and welcome to the online lesson that deals with APA formatting related issues. What I'd like to do in this lesson is go over some of the lesser known components of APA that relate to numerals versus numbers, some grammar things, tables, things related to statistics in particular, and just a few other things that are really important but you might not have noticed unless you really read through the entire manual. So I'm not going to talk about citations or formatting of citations or things like that. It's really other things APA related that you may not have had quite as much experience with. One of the things included in the APA manual is a description of how the various levels of heading should be formatted within the document. The chapter titles of a dissertation actually count as level 0, so they're not included in this table, and those are all caps, centered, not bolded, however. The first level of heading would be things such as sections of a dissertation labeled Statement of the Problem, Significance of the Study, Research Questions, and so on. And those headers, or that level of header, should be centered and bolded. The next level, which would be a subheader under a level 1 header, would be it would appear flush left and bolded. You would return after including the subheader in the document. So an example would be within the review of literature section, you might have major section headers, and then within each of the major sections have subheaders that allow you to group the information related to various categories or topics. And then if you need to go that far, a level 3 header would be indented and then bolded, ended with a period, and then you begin the text on that actual line, so you don't actually return in between. Another section in the APA manual deals with agreement of subject and verb, and this is something that I'm including here because it is a common error that people make within documents. So subjects and verbs always have to agree in number. So if the noun is singular, then the verb must also be singular, and that includes if you have intervening phrases or words such as together with, including, plus, or as well as. Basically, if you get rid of those intervening words and then read the sentence without them, that might help you determine whether to use a singular or plural word in its place. So in this case, the correct usage would be the percent of correct responses as well as the speed of the responses increases with practice. Percentage is singular, so the verb increases also must be singular. So incorrect would be if you used the word increase instead of increases to try to pair it with the singular word percentage. In addition, there are a couple of other kind of anomalies that are easy for people to have errors with, one of which is the word data. Data is a plural word, so you have to pair it with a plural verb. So in this case, the sentence, the data indicate that Terence was correct, is in fact a correctly written sentence. If you say the data indicates, you have a plural word here with a singular noun, and that is correct. The word datum is singular, and it's rarely used when we write about quantitative data. The other word that is very similar is the word phenomena, which is also plural, so you need to be sure to pair that with a plural verb. And continuing along the same lines in terms of not only singular and plural, but the antecedent has to agree with the pronoun in terms of gender as well. Now in this sentence, neither the highest scorer nor the lowest scorer had any doubt about his or her. That is correct because the word scorer is singular, and then the pronoun that it's paired with has to also be singular. So his or her, and because you need to make sure that it's gender neutral, you can't replace it with either one or the other or their. So if you use the word their in place of the phrase his or her, that's incorrect. Another thing to just be aware of is that if you're replacing a noun with a pronoun like who, that, or which, make sure you use who anytime it's paired with humans, and that or which when you have anything other than humans. So, for example, if you use a phrase like the students, since the students refers to a group of humans, you need to pair that with the word who and not that. The next example, the instructions that, I think is probably a little bit more apparent. And again, you have to use the word who with students, not the word that. The APA manual has a section that discusses misplaced and dangling modifiers, and I just want to mention that briefly. Basically, any word that you're using to describe something always needs to be placed as closely as possible to the word that it modifies. So what's considered a misplaced modifier is when you place the word away from what it's supposed to modify and maybe have a phrase in between that makes it unclear what is supposed to be modified by the adjective or adverb. So an incorrect usage would be if you wrote, the investigator tested the participants using this procedure. What's unclear about it is it's hard to understand who used the procedure, whether it was the investigator or whether it was the participants. So a more correct wording would be using this procedure. The investigator tested the participants, which now makes it clear that it's the investigator who's using the procedure. Or if that's not what was meant, you could say the investigator tested the participants who were using the procedure. Again, it makes it clear in that case who's using the procedure because you don't have a misplaced modifier. Similarly, if we say something like, based on this assumption, we developed a model, and so on, it implies that we are based on an assumption, which is probably not what the writer intended. So you can think of other ways of framing that, such as on the basis of this assumption, we developed a model, or based on the assumption, the model, and in both cases the language is much more clear. If you include the word only within a sentence, make sure that you place it immediately next to the word or phrase that it modifies. So an incorrect usage would be, these data only provide a partial answer. A correct version would be, these data provide only a partial answer. So again, it's the idea that words that you're using to modify something need to be placed as closely as possible to that word. Moving on, in APA, there are several situations in which italics would be used. Titles of books, periodicals, films, videos, and TV shows are always italicized. And then some lesser known usages would be if you are introducing some kind of a term or a label, something technical. For the first time, it is italicized in the text and thereafter would be written with normal text. So if you write the term backward masking, and this is where you're introducing that term, you would italicize it in the text. Also, if you're using letters, words, or phrases as linguistic examples, those examples would be italicized as well. You use numerals, which are digits, to express numbers 10 and above. Also, numbers that are included in the abstract of a document and any numbers that are included in graphical displays, including tables and figures, would be expressed as digits. Numbers that immediately precede any kind of unit of measurement. So here I say a 5 milligram dose, we could say 6 centimeters. So even though the numeral 5 would typically be written as a digit and not as a word, you would write it as a digit here. Also, numbers that present any kind of statistical or mathematical functions, fractional or decimal quantities, percentages, or ratios, such as multiply by 5, 3 times as many. Those are written as numerals even when the value is less than 10. And then times, dates, ages, scores and points on a scale, and exact sums of money. For example, if you're writing $1 million, the 1 million would be written as a numeral. So APA is very specific on those kinds of things, and it's something that you need to pay attention to, especially in your dissertation. Numerals, actually I said that one already. The last one is any kind of number that denotes a specific place in a series, table numbers, row numbers, grades. So we would say grade 8, although if you wrote the 8th grade, you would write out the word 8th. So words are used for numbers that begin a sentence, a title, or any kind of text heading, even if the word represents a number that would normally be expressed otherwise as a digit. And APA recommends rewriting the sentence if possible so that it doesn't need to begin with a number. If you do begin with a number, an example here would be where you need to write it out as a word. 48% of the sample showed an increase, and then later on in the sentence you would continue and use the numeral as appropriate. 12 students improved and 12 students did not improve. Common fractions are also written as words, which seems maybe a little counterintuitive, but this is what APA says is appropriate. And then there are some commonly accepted usages, probably not things that you will tend to use in a dissertation very often, but if you do encounter something like that, then know that it is acceptable in some cases to write words for numbers. What APA says regarding the use of zeros in values that include decimals is if the numbers can be greater than 1 but are not as you include them in the text, then you need to include a 0 before the decimal point. So for example, if you're representing a measure, and that measure could potentially be greater than 1, which pretty much any measure could be, then you would put a 0 in front of the decimal point when in fact the measurement isn't greater than 1. Cohen's d is a measure of effect size that we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester, and that could be greater than 1, so you would write a 0 in front of a value that is not. Number of seconds would also begin with a 0 if it is a partial value. So if the statistic cannot be greater than 1, which would be things like correlations, R values, which we'll talk about a little bit later, proportions, and p-values can only be less than 1, then you never write a 0 in front of the decimal. So you have to think about what's possible to help you determine whether a 0 should be there or not. APA also indicates that you need to report all of the statistical values, the computed values, such as r, t, f, and chi-squared, to 2 decimal places. So that might not have a lot of meaning to you at this point in the semester, but it certainly will later on. So it also says that p-values should be reported either to 2 or 3 decimals, but whatever one of those you choose, you should be consistent throughout, and I would suggest that 2 values is sufficient. But it also says that if you have a p-value less than 0.001, that instead of carrying it out to more decimal places, then just say p is less than 0.001. For example, when we are running statistics in SPSS, because of the rounding that the program does, you may sometimes see a computed p-value of 0.0000. That's not the actual value, it's just the value as rounded to 4 decimal places. So writing p less than 0.001 is actually more accurate than writing p equals 0.0000. If you are using written word numbers, either figures or numbers, you add an S or an ES, but you don't add an apostrophe. For example, if you write the number 4s, you write the number 6s, there's no apostrophe in either one of those. Also, calendar dates like the 1950s, 1960s, those do not include an apostrophe, which is a common error that people make. 10s and 20s, similarly, do not include an apostrophe. In order to effectively present your information to a reader so that they don't have to spend a lot of time and effort reading narrative and trying to figure out the meaning of things, you can make choices about the most effective way to display information. So you can choose text, you can choose tables, you can choose figures. So what APA recommends is if you have 3 or fewer numbers, write them in a sentence. If you have between 4 to 20 numbers, then create a table with that information. And if you have more than 20 numbers, create a graph. So these are just general guidelines, not hard and fast kinds of things that you need to adhere to, but I do think if you consider the reader and the ease of comprehending the information for the reader, then that will help guide you as well. APA also says that you don't need to provide citations to justify the use of certain statistical analyses. So if you decide that running a multiple ANOVA is appropriate for your study, you don't have to say, here's the name of the person who said that it would be appropriate. You can just say MANOVA was used and end it with that. APA indicates that there are certain pieces of information regarding the statistical analyses that you run that need to be reported. You need to report whatever the test statistic is, so T, F, chi-square, R, and others. You also need to report the degrees of freedom. And again, if you don't know what all these things are right now, that's okay. We will learn them all during the semester. You need to report the p-value, and you need to report some kind of effect size. So something that gives an indication of the size of the effect and the direction of the effect. You need to report standard deviation, which is a measure of variability, confidence interval, and effect size. So based on the different analyses that we run, we will report Cohen's d, we might report eta squared, and there are some others as well. If you choose to create a table or a figure with numeric information, APA says you don't need to also include that same information in the text. However, you do need to let the reader know where the information is located. So you need to say something like, as found in table 15, or whatever it happens to be. In terms of the percent symbol, you use the symbol only when there's a numeral in front of it. If you don't have a numeral, if you just say the percentage of correct responses is, then you have to write the word and not use the symbol. So in this case, 18% of the rats, we have the symbol because we have a numeral in front of it. Notice that there's no space between the 8 and the percent symbol. And then here in this sentence, we're using the word because there's no number to go along with it. If you do report percentage information in tables or figures, then you always use the symbol to conserve space. If you use a statistical term in the narrative of your document, so you're actually writing it as part of paragraphs, then you actually write out the word. So the example here is the term means. You wouldn't put an M, even though if you use the same thing in a table, you would abbreviate it with an M. And then just to clarify, anytime you see a capital letter N, which by the way is italicized, that represents the number of people in the entire sample, whereas lowercase n's represent the number of people in each subgroup. So if you have a table and within that table you're trying to demonstrate maybe the responses based on people in group A, B, and C, then you'll have a little n to represent the number of people in group A, in group B, and in group C. If you create tables, make sure that you're not including extraneous information in the tables. When SPSS produces its output, it has not only multiple tables, but within each table it has a lot of information that APA doesn't require you report to the reader. So you'll need to actually create your own tables that are very refined, very customized, and very pertinent to what it is you're trying to report to the reader. As I said before, you always need to refer to the table number someplace in the narrative close to where you discuss the information. The title of each table is italicized. The table number itself is not italicized. So you'll say table 1, you'll hit a return, and then in the next line you have your table title in italics. The first letter of major words is capitalized in the table title, which is a little bit different than how things go in figures. Figures would be used when you have a lot of times graphical information that would make it easier for the reader to understand what it is you're trying to convey. And again, it shouldn't have extra information. It should be very focused. You need to make sure that it's easy to read and understand. APA says that you should use a font that has sans serifs, which means it doesn't have the little lines underneath the letters. For example, this is a serif font because you can see it's got little lines at the end of the N's and the R and the I and so on. You need to make sure that if there are axes, they're clearly labeled so the reader knows what the information in the figures is trying to convey. And within the narrative, you need to make sure that whatever information is included in the figure is made explicit to the reader. So you will write some kind of narrative about the figure. Unlike tables, the figure number actually appears below the figure, and the word figure and the number, so figure 3, would be in italics. There's a period, and that's followed by the figure title, which is not italicized, and only the first word is capitalized, except for proper nouns. So the formatting for table titles and figure titles it's different for each one. So I don't know that you need to memorize that, but you definitely need to know where to go to look it up if you don't remember. And that about does it. At this point, you can go into Blackboard and you can take the quiz with regard to the APA content that I just covered. You can take it twice, so that if you're not satisfied with your score the first time, you can give it a try again. You're welcome to review this information anytime, both within the context of the class and afterwards if you save the link to be able to access it. Have a great day.